What if the future we're living in was already imagined 60 years ago? Back when the world was racing to the moon, filmmakers across continents dreamed up worlds filled with lunar bases, artificial intelligence, and deep space rescues that sounded impossible until now. They weren't just making science fiction, they were predicting headlines from the year 2025. So buckle up, because these 12 forgotten space race movies didn't just look ahead, they nailed it. Road to the Stars, 1957. Before 2001, A Space Odyssey, before Star Wars, a Soviet filmmaker named Pavel Klushantsev quietly built the blueprint for everything we know about space travel. Road to the Stars wasn't just a movie, it was a prophecy. Released in 1957, the same year Sputnik orbited Earth, it combined documentary realism with speculative vision. Klushantsev used miniature effects, rotating space stations, and zero-gravity choreography that looked decades ahead of its time. The film unfolds like a visual textbook of the future, humans floating in orbit, assembling modular space stations, walking on the moon, and even planning the first Mars expeditions. Every scene feels like a frame ripped from modern NASA footage. It's eerie because so much of it came true. What's wild is how Road to the Stars managed all this on a shoestring budget. Klushantsev built scale models by hand, filmed through aquariums for a floating effect, and even designed mock-ups of docking procedures that NASA engineers later cited as reference material. His attention to technical accuracy was so remarkable that American scientists reportedly studied the film to understand Soviet space concepts. The movie's final act dares to imagine orbital cities complete with solar panels and robotic assistance concepts that map almost perfectly to the international projects unfolding today, the Lunar Gateway, orbital refueling, and even the Artemis missions. Yet, despite its genius, Road to the Stars vanished into obscurity, overshadowed by politics and Cold War propaganda fears. But watching it now feels like stepping into a time capsule where one man's cinematic dream quietly foretold the 21st century space age. Klushantsev once said he didn't want to predict the future only to inspire it. Turns out, he did both. The Heavens Call, 1959. If you ever wondered what a Cold War space race thriller would look like before the space race even started, The Heavens Call is your answer. Released in 1959, this Soviet film imagined two rival missions racing toward Mars and beat NASA and the USSR's real-life Mars programs by at least a decade. What makes it fascinating isn't just the competition, it's the collaboration. In a twist that feels oddly modern, the rival astronauts end up joining forces to survive, setting aside national pride for human survival. Sound familiar? That's the exact premise behind international space partnerships today, from the ISS to the Artemis Accords. Director Mikhail Karyukov filled the movie with hauntingly accurate details. You see astronauts training underwater to simulate zero gravity. There's a realistic depiction of orbital mechanics, complete with space rendezvous scenes that look uncannily like actual footage from Apollo missions years later. Even the communication delays between Earth and Mars were portrayed with startling precision. But here's where it gets prophetic. The Heavens Call warned about orbital congestion decades before space debris became a real problem. In one striking sequence, a damaged craft drifts through a field of abandoned satellites and debris, an image that could have been lifted straight from modern NASA simulations of Earth's cluttered orbit. For all its artistry, Western audiences barely knew it existed. The movie was dubbed, re-edited, and released under different titles, often without credit to its creators. Ironically, its visual effects later influenced Stanley Kubrick and George Pal filmmakers, who received global acclaim for similar imagery. Watching it today feels almost surreal. It's not a relic, it's a mirror. The film's central message still hits home in 2025. If humanity wants to survive in space, it can't afford to compete, it has to cooperate. And for a movie born in the height of rivalry, that's one prediction we should all hope comes true. Planet of Storms, 1962. Now here's one that feels like a lost prototype for every space survival movie that came after. Planet of Storms is a Soviet gem from 1962 that throws a small crew, a robot named John, and a lander onto the surface of Venus years before anyone had realistic data on what that planet was actually like. The film's premise sounds like pulp science fiction, but the execution is shockingly forward-thinking. The astronauts navigate an alien world filled with volcanic terrain, electrical storms, and dense fog. They use drones, amphibious vehicles, and remote communication relays, ideas that mirror what modern planetary missions actually do. Swap their clunky radar dishes for today's satellite arrays, and it could pass for a NASA simulation. Robot John deserves his own shout-out. He's lumbering, loyal, and emotional, the clear ancestor of HAL 9000 and Wall-E, rolled into one. Decades before artificial intelligence became a household term, this film explored how humans project emotion onto machines. When John sacrifices himself to save the crew, it's not just sentimental, it's startlingly predictive of the human-robot relationship, explored in 21st century tech ethics debates. And here's a twist most people never knew. The film's visuals were so impressive that American producers later recut it into two different English-language movies, Voyage to the Prehistoric Planet and Voyage to the Planet of Prehistoric Women without Siaram, crediting the original Soviet creators. Those versions got forgotten, but Khrushchev's vision endured. Rewatch Planet of Storms today, and it feels like a dry run for interplanetary colonization. Terraforming debates, robotic assistance, international missions. It's all there, hidden under the fog of an alien world imagined long before we ever sent probes to Venus. It's not just a movie. It's an unintentional prophecy of what exploration would become when imagination finally caught up with technology. Ikari XB1, 1963. If there's one film that feels like a direct ancestor to Star Trek, Solaris, and Alien, it's Ikari XB1. Released in 1963 in Czechoslovakia, this quiet masterpiece imagined deep space travel not as a thrill ride, but as an existential experience. The plot follows a crew traveling toward the mysterious White Planet, a journey that takes years and tests the limits of isolation, boredom, and human endurance. What makes it jaw-dropping today is how accurately it predicted modern concerns about long-duration missions. You see the effects of sleep disruption, cabin claustrophobia, even ethical dilemmas about artificial hibernation. Every set design, every flicker of light in Ikari XB1 feels eerily modern. The ship interiors resemble the International Space Station modular, functional, and sterile. The crew interacts with intelligent systems, automated assistants, and mood-regulating technology. Replace the analog switches with touch screens, and you're basically watching a documentary about a 2025 Mars mission. And let's not forget the tone. While American sci-fi of the era obsessed over aliens and lasers, Ikari XB1 went inward. It asked what happens to people when space becomes routine. It's not the cosmic monsters that threaten them, but fatigue, memory, and melancholy. That's the same psychological tension modern astronauts face, according to NASA's behavioral studies. The film's influence is legendary, even if most people don't know it. Stanley Kubrick reportedly viewed it while developing 2001, A Space Odyssey, and several scenes like the eerie discovery of an abandoned ship feel almost lifted from Ikari's script. But here's what seals its prophetic legacy. At its core, it isn't about reaching the stars, it's about surviving the silence between them. In that sense, Ikari XB1 predicted the most human challenge of 2025's space age, not getting to Mars, but learning how to stay human on the way there. A Dream Come True, 1963. If the Heaven's Call was the dream of reaching Mars, A Dream Come True, or Mechta Navstrechu, was the nightmare of what might go wrong once we got there. Released in the same year, 1963, it imagines a distress call from Mars that brings two civilizations face to face for the first time. At first glance, it's a hopeful film. Earth's astronauts respond to an SOS from an alien craft, leading to a tense but ultimately cooperative encounter. But beneath that optimism lies something far more prophetic. The movie explores interplanetary rescue logistics, resource sharing, and cross-species communication concepts that feel like blueprints for today's international mission planning. Visually, it's breathtaking. The filmmakers used elaborate miniatures, double exposure, and early motion control techniques to depict landers docking and spacecraft performing orbital maneuvers. In an era before digital anything, it's astonishingly precise. Watching those sequences today feels like peering into the design simulations of the Artemis program or SpaceX's crewed Mars concepts. What really stands out, though, is the theme of misunderstanding. The alien distress signal is initially seen as a threat mirroring our own modern debates about unidentified transmissions and first contact protocol. The film quietly argues for empathy, for assuming curiosity over hostility, a stance that echoes SETI's own philosophy in the 21st century. Critics in its day dismissed it as slow and too thoughtful, but that's exactly what makes it visionary. Rather than chase pulp excitement, A Dream Come True lingered on communication delays, translation challenges, and human doubt. Those very details now define real-world space operations, where minutes-long delays and uncertain signals can decide life or death. In the end, the title wasn't ironic. It truly was a dream come true, just one the world wasn't ready to understand yet. Watching it in 2025, it feels less like science fiction and more like a quiet rehearsal for humanity's next great leap. First Men in the Moon, 1964. Before astronauts planted flags or built bases, there was this: a Victorian gentleman, a dreamer scientist, and a spacecraft powered by Cavorite. First Men in the Moon, based on H.G. Wells' novel and released in 1964, took the concept of lunar exploration and layered it with something eerily modern: the fear of contamination and the politics of discovery. The story opens with a multinational lunar team in the future discovering an old British flag already planted on the moon. That twist alone feels startlingly like a prediction of the modern-day scramble for lunar territory and resource rights. But beyond its humor and fantasy, the movie nailed key themes we still wrestle with in 2025: planetary protection, ownership, and the ethics of being first. Director Nathan Juran, with effects legend Ray Harryhausen, gave us a moon not as a glowing symbol, but as a harsh, alien environment. Jagged craters, fragile ecosystems, and underground civilizations, the same conversations scientists have today about lunar lava tubes and preserving untouched terrain. And let's not overlook the mock press conference that opens the film, with journalists demanding access to exclusive footage from space, a clear forecast of how media spectacle would later dominate real space events. It's also one of the first sci-fi films to ask, what if humanity isn't the pioneer we think we are? When the explorers encounter the insect-like selenites beneath the moon's surface, it becomes a lesson in humility, an allegory for colonialism dressed as adventure. The idea that the moon might have been occupied, studied, or protected by another intelligence prefigures debates about contamination protocols NASA still enforces today. While audiences of the 60s saw it as whimsical fun, it quietly anticipated the real moral dilemmas of lunar exploration. Watching it now, you can't help but think it's not just who gets there first, but what happens when we do. The Moon, 1965. You've probably never heard of The Moon, and that's exactly the tragedy. Released in 1965 in the Soviet Union, this half-documentary, half-speculative piece imagined what life on a lunar base would look like decades before such a concept was technically possible. It wasn't fiction for fiction's sake. It was a simulation. The filmmakers used real engineering studies, early cosmonaut footage, and speculative animation to piece together a vision of permanent lunar habitation. They showed rotating habitats for artificial gravity, greenhouses for oxygen regeneration, and automated mining, all of which now exist in the blueprint phase of 2025's lunar colonization plans. What's wild is how the moon captured the balance between danger and monotony that space workers now describe. Astronauts maintain machinery, log data, and face the creeping loneliness of endless routine, something only later dramatized by movies like Moon, 2009, and The Martian. The set design feels industrial, functional, and oddly modern. No chrome rocket fins or pulsing ray beams, just pipes, hatches, and warning lights. It feels like the world NASA and SpaceX are building right now, down to the smallest detail. There's also an emotional undercurrent that feels surprisingly contemporary. The crew discusses the meaning of leaving Earth forever, the cost of progress, when home becomes a distant blue memory. It's a poetic tone rarely found in Cold War cinema, and that's what makes it timeless. Today, with space agencies planning multi-year lunar bases, the moon feels less like prophecy and more like an early training video for a future finally catching up. Its final sequence shows a cosmonaut gazing across the cratered horizon, whispering a line that hits harder than ever. We came to explore, but we stayed to survive. That single moment predicted exactly what space travel would become, not a race, but a residence. Countdown 1967. By the late 60s, America was in full moon race mode, and Countdown, directed by Robert Altman, dared to ask a question few wanted to hear. What if we rushed and something went wrong? Released in 1967, Countdown tells the story of a desperate last-ditch effort to beat the Soviets to the moon. The plan? Send an astronaut early, have him live in a pre-delivered shelter, and wait for rescue. It sounds thrilling, but the film plays it terrifyingly straight. Logistical problems, political pressure, and moral compromises all pile up. What makes it prophetic is its obsession with risk management and mission psychology. The film portrays space not as glory, but as bureaucracy and fatigue. Engineers argue over launch windows, politicians overtake science, and the astronaut, played by James Caan, becomes a pawn in a race he no longer believes in. That kind of institutional realism didn't hit mainstream sci-fi again until The Right Stuff decades later. Altman insisted on filming at NASA facilities and using real mission protocols. The result feels so authentic, it borders on documentary. The cramped habitat, the reliance on minimal resources, the silent dread of isolation, it all anticipates today's debates about safety on long-term lunar outposts. There's even a chilling echo of 2025's rescue architecture proposals, protocols for saving stranded astronauts on the moon. Back then, it was fiction. Now, it's a PowerPoint in Houston. At its core, Countdown isn't about technology, it's about obsession. It predicted that space exploration would stop being a romantic adventure and become a test of endurance, politics, and timing. When the movie ends, you're left unsure whether the mission succeeded or failed. That ambiguity is haunting, because in a way, it still hasn't been resolved. Even today, every lunar ambition carries the same question. How much risk are we really willing to take to be first? The Andromeda Nebula, 1967. If there was ever a movie that visualized the internet decades before it existed, it was The Andromeda Nebula. Released in the Soviet Union in 1967, this deeply philosophical film dared to imagine a galaxy where civilizations were linked by a great ring, a vast interstellar communication network that connected countless worlds. Sounds like science fantasy, right? Until you realize it's basically describing the 21st century's digital infrastructure. Based on Ivan Yefremov's novel, the story follows explorers sent on a distant voyage to study a strange nebula that might hold the secret to life itself. But what begins as an adventure turns into a study of communication, isolation, and the limits of technology. The ship's crew relies on real-time data links and long-distance transmission protocols eerily similar to what we now call deep space relay systems. Its depiction of message delay between worlds is remarkably prescient. Conversations take minutes or even hours to transmit exactly what space agencies deal with when operating Mars rovers or planning lunar communications today. The film even hints at the concept of distributed artificial intelligence, as each planet in the Great Ring contributes knowledge to a shared network of learning. Visually, it's hypnotic. Glowing circuitry, light-wave communications, and crew members suspended in luminous cryochambers. It's less about space battles and more about space consciousness, an idea that modern audiences, immersed in data, can instantly relate to. What's most prophetic, though, is the film's moral core. It warned that faster communication doesn't mean better understanding, that in the quest to connect everything, humans risk losing the ability to feel. In an age when we send data to Mars but struggle to connect across dinner tables, the Andromeda Nebula feels like a quiet whisper from the past, saying, "We saw this coming." So while most sci-fi films imagine rockets, this one predicted relationships between people, machines, and the endless space between. Journey to the Far Side of the Sun, 1969. What if there was another Earth, an exact duplicate hidden on the far side of the Sun? That was the premise of Journey to the Far Side of the Sun, a British production from 1969 that combined Cold War paranoia, European politics, and eerie scientific speculation. But what it really predicted was the 21st century's obsession with mirror realities, simulation theory, and surveillance. The story follows Eurosec, a pan-European space agency created to rival NASA and the Soviets. Decades before the real European Space Agency existed, this film imagined exactly that: a united space front, complete with multinational crews and political infighting. It was prophetic to the core. When the mission's crew discovers a duplicate Earth, everything begins to unravel. Gravity reverses, time seems out of sync, and instruments fail. It's less about discovery and more about disorientation, a reflection of the era's anxiety over truth and illusion. But rewatch it now, and it feels chillingly modern. Substitute duplicate planet with digital mirror world, and you've got the perfect metaphor for virtual reality and AI-driven simulation experiments of 2025. The movie's visual realism came from Jerry and Sylvia Anderson, the minds behind Thunderbirds. They used groundbreaking miniature work, detailed spacecraft interiors, and real aerospace consultants to design believable future tech. The result? A film that looks like a prequel to Interstellar or The Martian. But beyond its aesthetics, Journey to the Far Side of the Sun offered a warning. The more advanced our technology becomes, the easier it is to lose perspective. The final scene, an astronaut shattered before a distorted reflection, feels like a cinematic prophecy about our own era of screens and duplication. It wasn't just predicting future science, it was predicting future confusion. A world where progress outpaces understanding. A mirror Earth where we're still trying to figure out which side we're really on. Marooned, 1969. While Apollo 11 was making history, Marooned was predicting disaster. Released just months after the real moon landing, this American film imagined 3 astronauts stranded in space, their oxygen running out, while the world below argued over how to bring them home. It's one of the most realistic portrayals of a space crisis ever made, and shockingly, it foresaw real events that wouldn't happen until decades later. NASA would actually develop rescue mission protocols nearly identical to the film's premise, preparing for scenarios exactly like the one Marooned dramatized. Director John Sturges worked with real NASA engineers, even using authentic spacecraft mock-ups. The detail is astonishing. Flight checklists, atmospheric re-entry calculations, and communication delays are portrayed with documentary precision. There's no melodrama, just the slow, unbearable tension of time slipping away. Then comes the twist that feels almost prophetic for 2025. A rival nation, once seen as an enemy, becomes the crew's only hope. A Soviet capsule attempts a daring rescue years before the Apollo-Soyuz test project made U.S.-Soviet cooperation a reality. It's a moment of unexpected humanity that predicted the eventual collaboration that defines today's space programs. The film won an Academy Award for its special effects, but its emotional power came from its restraint. There's no villain, no explosion, just human fragility against an indifferent void. That quiet realism made it both groundbreaking and, ironically, too slow for audiences expecting fantasy. But Marooned has aged better than anyone expected. Its questions about cost, politics, and cooperation echo directly into the 21st century. It wasn't predicting doom, it was warning us about complacency. Every time modern astronauts practice emergency extraction or joint rescue training, they're living out the movie's thesis. In space, survival isn't about competition, it's about compassion. Moon 02, 1969. They called it the first moon western. That alone should tell you Moon 02 wasn't your typical space movie. Released in 1969, the same year humanity actually set foot on the moon, this British production imagined a future where lunar exploration had gone corporate and the frontier had turned into a business deal. Think about that for a second. A movie made before the Apollo dust had even settled already saw the next big space story not as exploration, but as commerce. In this version of the future, ex-astronauts work as freelancers, prospectors claim lunar real estate, and rich investors fight over asteroid mining rights. Sound familiar? That's basically the 2025 space economy in a nutshell. The hero, played by James Olsen, is a former space pilot turned salvage man. He's hired to tow a valuable asteroid made of sapphire back to the moon, but of course, corporate greed and sabotage intervene. Beneath the pulp adventure plot, is a biting satire about privatized space travel, inequality, and what happens when humanity turns the cosmos into a marketplace. Visually, Moon 02 nails the look of retrofuturism. It blends 60s mod fashion with dusty lunar landscapes, creating a strange world that feels both absurd and weirdly plausible. There are lunar buggies, modular outposts, and even a mining operation that eerily mirrors modern plans for resource extraction. Critics at the time didn't know what to make of it. Some dismissed it as campy nonsense, others recognized its startling realism buried beneath the humor. The irony is that the movie's once laughable predictions, private space companies, lunar mining permits, and asteroid resource laws are now global headlines. What makes Moon 02 endure isn't its style, it's its message. It predicted that the space race wouldn't end with peace on Earth, but with a new scramble beyond it. A Wild West reborn on the moon, where ambition is infinite, but ethics are optional. Half a century later, as billionaires build rockets and nations debate lunar ownership, it's hard not to feel like we're living inside the sequel. From Soviet dreamers to British satirists, these forgotten films didn't just imagine rockets and robots, they foresaw the world we now inhabit. They warned, inspired, and sometimes laughed their way toward truths we're still catching up to. Because the space race never really ended, it just changed direction. So, as we step deeper into the 2025 frontier, one question lingers. Did we create the future, or simply follow their script?